what's going on in the upper story at this point? God is raising that special nation. He's raising a people that will show the whole world what it looks like to be in community with God. And more than that, God wants to raise this special nation in such a way that there's no doubt where they came from. No doubt about what the origin is, how they came about. So how's God going to do that? In a very, very straightforward way for him, he's going to bring this nation about in the most impossible way that just couldn't have happened any other way. So here he picks this man named Abram. There is a whole litany, a whole list of impossibilities and unlikelihoods at the very least that happen for the development, for the raising of this nation. And this morning, I just want to take some time to maybe take a little consideration on some of the things in that list. And it's a list I call the not very likely list. And on that not very likely list, not very likely number one is this. God chooses a couple beyond the years of change. God chooses a couple beyond the years of change. Well, what exactly does that mean? Okay, I'm just going to get honest and talk turkey. And I can't because I'm getting a little long in the tooth myself. And I've noticed this. As I get older, I'm not as big about change. If I'm comfortable with something, I like to stay there. But here's a man, in the initial call from God, 65 years old, just the first hint from God on all of this. And he is called to extreme change. And he's called to change, and it's not like life is going bad for him. He had a flourishing business. He was in the sheep business, and he was doing really well. He had servants, he had livestock, he had all this stuff. Big portfolio. And God tells him, get up from your comfort, and I'm going to send you somewhere. Imagine yourself at this point. God says, go. He doesn't tell you where, he just says, go. Leave all the comfort. At 65, that's quite a call from Abram's standpoint. He doesn't know what's yet to happen. All he knows, and he's sure of, is God has told him to go. And not very likely number two is this. God chooses the physically incapable in this case. The physically incapable. Abram was given a grand promise that he would father a nation. Well, no matter what the nation, there's one thing you need, is people. There must be people. 65, then 75, and no children. That's quite a promise to somebody of 75 who is childless to say, well, guess what? You're going to father this nation of people. Doesn't seem very likely. And if it's unlikely for Abram, for Sarai, it was downright impossible. And that very unlikely leads to very unlikely number three. God sets an impossible schedule. Now, if God told you you were going to father a nation at 65, you would say, well, I better get started right away, because there's not much time left. But 10 years go by, 75, still no children. And time just keeps pushing on by, no children. God's schedule for making this happen seems ludicrous. And to think of the patience and the faith that this couple must have had, to even believe it at 65, let alone pushing now 85, that God. So they have amazing patience, they have amazing faith. But even for them, it runs out, and they decide to, Sarai being a practical lady, comes up with a practical solution, something a little more reasonable, what God is coming up with. And she comes up with the idea, well, at least Hagar, our servant, she's childbearing age. So go and have a child with her, and at least God's plan will be half right. You know, this tendency, God's plan, his schedule doesn't quite match up with us, so we decide to help him out a little bit. And we do God's part, as what she tried to do. So they do this thing, try to make it this practical thing of helping God out a little bit, and Hagar does have a son. She has Ishmael. And the whole thing's a disaster. We know from our standpoint, what happens? 4,000 years down from the birth of Ishmael, and the descendants of Ishmael are still at war with the descendants of Sarai. So you would think, wow, that's enough story in itself, isn't it, for this man? What a life. But it isn't over. God's not done with him yet. In Genesis 21:5, something else happens. 21:5 of Genesis. Now Abraham was 100 years old, and when his son Isaac was born to him. So here it is. I want you to kind of use your imagination here for a second. Imagine that you've waited almost a century for this one child to come about. Imagine how precious that child would be to you. Imagine the value. But for Abraham, it went beyond that, because not only was Isaac this long-awaited son, he was God's promise in the flesh. He was God's promise that you could touch and look at it. It was proof that God was doing what he said he was going to do. There he was, his faith on legs, walking around. And then we get unlikelihood number 4. God demands an impossible test. Ever happened to you that way? It seems like God's testing you in some way, and he said, this is just too much. It's just impossible. Imagine Abraham in Genesis 22:1. Imagine this from the lower story. There you are with the son you were so grateful God gave you. And then God says, I'm going to take him away. How impossible is it, son? How cruel, how completely crazy that God should say this kind of a thing, this test. It looks totally brutal from the lower story view, from the day-to-day view. And then God goes on to say something like this: Abraham, take your son, your only begotten son, sacrifice him on the mountain, which you will soon call Yahweh Ra'ah, or in other words, the Lord will provide. Keep in mind how the Hebrew used names. If you named a place, it was always named for something that happened there. It was always some event. So I'm going to kill my only son up on this mountain, and then I'm going to call the mountain the Lord will provide. How does that work? But he does. He heads off to do his thing. 2,000 years later, in the unfolding of the upper story, the big picture, we're told things in words like this: for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. And when they had come to the place called Golgotha, that is to say, the place of a skull, that mountain, there they crucified that Son. Now when the centurion who stood opposite him saw that he had cried out like this and breathed his last, he said, truly, this man was the Son of God. In this big picture, we have 2 mountains. And on these 2 mountains, the Lord provided on both. On one mountain, he spared the Son of a man. And on the second mountain, he did not spare the Son of man, his son. But God was testing him, as well as giving a message. He was testing Abraham for the one thing that God looks for from him and from us, and that's trust. That God is in control. The right thing is going to happen. It's the perfect plan unfolding if we follow. So in all of this, what do we learn? We learn that as God unfolds the upper story, sometimes it can seem so unreasonable. It can seem almost cruel sometimes. It can seem out of control sometimes, but God is never out of control. And our part, whatever it may be in the physical details, is going to involve the same things all the time. Trusting, obeying, and following God's will. And not just following God's will, but following God's will according to his time.